Continuing on with our discussion of the British colonial world, today we're going to be talking about some of the conflicts that emerge as the British North American colonies continue to grow. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about some of the key developments that are going to set colonial North America on a path as we begin to move towards the American Revolution, which we will be talking about next week. So first, I want us to start in New England by talking about a key conflict that occurs between British colonists in the New England colonies and the local indigenous peoples called King Philip's War. King Philip was the British name for an indigenous man by the name of Metacom. Metacom was the leader of the Wampanoag Indians who are settled in what is today Massachusetts. So as in so many other places in colonial North America, what had happened is that British settlers had continuously been encroaching onto Indian lands. And of course, that made it harder and harder for surviving indigenous peoples to survive, to make a living. And so in 1675, having had sort of enough of this continued invasion by British settlers, an Indian alliance was organized and retaliated by attacking English settlements. Now, the English specifically blame Metacom, the man that they called King Philip. But in fact, he actually was only leading the Wampanoag forces. In fact, each individual indigenous group in this alliance had its own leader. So it really was an alliance in every sense of the word. In a wave of attacks, the indigenous alliance is able to destroy 12 towns in Massachusetts, either killing or taking captive the English settlers there. And basically a very, very bloody war on both sides. An estimated 1,000 English settlers, and keep in mind there's only 52,000 of them in the New England area, and an estimated 3,000 indigenous peoples out of an estimated surviving population of 20,000 will die in the fighting. So the war goes on for almost a year, and it's a very bloody war on both sides. Ultimately, the English are able to get the Iroquois on their side. So the Iroquois, one of the larger, more powerful indigenous groups that we've talked about, join the war on the English side. And then between the combined forces of the English and the Iroquois, they're able to turn the tide of war in the English favor. Ultimately, Metacom himself is killed. And of the people who had risen in rebellion on the indigenous side, many of them are captured, and in fact, quite a few of them are actually sold into slavery in the Caribbean. So not only are they defeated in war, but then they are shipped away to really almost certain death as slaves in the Caribbean. And this was the English way to make sure that they would never be able to fight or to raise arms against the English again. So why do we need to know about King Philip's War? Well, really for two reasons. The first is that even though it was incredibly vicious on both sides, for the English in particular, King Philip's War will be remembered as an example of how allegedly savage Indians are. So for New England colonists for several generations, they will refer back to King Philip's War in talking about the alleged savagery and the bloodiness of indigenous peoples, which again is not really fair. It was a grisly war on both sides, but it really colors the way English settlers in New England think about indigenous peoples. The other reason I want us to remember King Philip's War is paired with Bacon's Rebellion, which hopefully you have in your notes. We talked about it in our last lecture. It really helps illustrate some of the ongoing instability in Britain's North American colonies. So even though they are growing, both in terms of geography and in terms of population, there still is a tremendous amount of instability in the British North American colonies, and that in turn will lead to problems down the line. And some of those In addition to continuing instability in the British North American colonies, it's also worth noting that things are changing back home in England as well. This is a time period that in British history is referred to as the Glorious Revolution. What had happened in a very short version is that after King Charles II passes away, he's succeeded on the throne of England by his brother, King James II. Now, the problem was that King James II was a Catholic, and as we've talked a lot about in this class, England was very, very committed to being a Protestant nation, to the point that the head of the Church of England was assumed to be the monarch. So understandably, there are a lot of English who are not at all comfortable with the idea of having King James II as their king. And so in 1688, what happens is they actually force King James II off the throne in favor of one of his heirs. His daughter Mary was a Protestant, and she was married to a Dutch nobleman by the name of William of Orange. So William and Mary become the new King and Queen of England in 1688, Protestant King and Queen of England in 1688, hence the Glorious Revolution. It's also called glorious because there's basically no bloodshed involved. This isn't a war. This is simply sort of, if you will, not so politely asking James II to leave and replacing him with William and Mary. And this is important to us as an American history class for a couple of reasons. First off, it reaffirms that Britain is indeed a Protestant nation. It also is an opportunity for the English to pass their first ever Bill of Rights, which Parliament does in 1689. As I'm sure you know, Parliament is the legislative body in England. It's roughly equivalent to our Congress, although it does function somewhat differently. So in 1689, as part of the Glorious Revolution, for the first time, Parliament passes an English Bill of Rights. And it does some basic things in terms of establishing who has power in England and over what. So, for example, the English Bill of Rights declares that Parliament has control over taxation. So it cannot be the king or queen who decides who gets taxed. It's going to be Parliament. The English Bill of Rights also includes some individual rights, probably not nearly as many as we would expect, but it has things in it such as a right to trial by jury. So in other words, if you are accused of a crime, you have a right to a trial by jury. And these are all rights that traditionally had not existed in England. So what you're seeing coming out of the Glorious Revolution is really an assertion that the monarch, whether it's a king or a queen, is no longer that even he or she is subject to the rule of law. So power increasingly is understood to be something that has to be shared between the crown and Parliament, and that individuals do at least have some individual rights. And these ideas are going to have very long-term implications in the American colonies as we move through the century and we get closer to the American Revolution. In the short term, though, it's also worth noting that the Glorious Revolution creates some changes on the ground in the British North American colonies as well. It's sort of upends and mix up and shakes up some of the power relationships in the colonies as well. And I'll just give you one example. As part of the reform coming out of the Glorious Revolution in 1691, England decides to combine the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies together into one colony, just called the Massachusetts colony. And as part of that reform, England insists that property ownership, not church membership, is the qualification for voting rights. You may remember back in the day when the Puritans had control over these colonies, you had to be a church member in good standing in order to have the right to vote. You, of course, also needed to be white and male. And the English don't change the male part of it. But they do at least say that power, or at least the right to vote, that form of power, needs to be tied to property ownership, not church membership, the way the Puritans had insisted for generations. England also insists that the Massachusetts colony abide by the New English Toleration Act of 1690. And that was simply a law that requires toleration of all Protestant forms of religious worship. So England does not require toleration of Catholics. We just saw what happened to James II. They certainly don't require toleration of Jews or Muslims or anything like that. But this was designed to end some of the decades of conflict around some of the splinter forms of Protestants that we've talked about. Right? We've talked about Quakers, we've talked about Puritans. So the English Toleration Act of 1690 says, okay, in England, as long as it's a Protestant form of religion, we will not discriminate against those folks and they can practice their religion freely. And so England is now insisting that the North American colonies that didn't do that in the past, most notably Massachusetts, do that. So you can imagine for the still largely Puritan Massachusetts colony, they're not exactly thrilled at the idea of having to now tolerate Now, of course, if we're looking for signs of chaos and dissension in the British North American colonies, we really can't do much better than look at arguably one of the most famous episodes in American colonial history, and that is, of course, the Salem witch trials. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this, and that is, of course, the Salem witch trials. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the Salem witch trials in terms of being another example of this instability that we've talked about. So the first thing we have to remember is that the New England colonies, Massachusetts in particular, were already colonists. We've talked about King Philip's War and the chaos and death that King Philip's War brought. We've talked about the fact that they've now been forced to tolerate the presence of other Protestant religions, which they hadn't before. So the Puritans were already, if you will, under a lot of stress from a sort of cultural and religious perspective by the time we get to the 1690s. Things were changing, they knew things were changing, and they certainly were not necessarily happy with those changes. Now, what we also have to factor into this story, though, is we do have to remember that Puritans, although of course very, very religious people, are also very much people of their time. Just like Europeans in the 17th century, in the 1600s, they are very much people who have a lot of superstitious belief. So for Puritans, as sort of godly as they were, superstition exists side by side with religion, and there wasn't sort of a contradiction between that, as perhaps we might today think there is. Witches, for example, are very real to both Americans and Europeans in the 1600s. Fortune telling is very real. Magic telling is very real. Magic is real. Astrology. So these are, in addition to being very, very religious people, these are also very superstitious people. And that can be a very, very dangerous combination. And I think what happens at Salem is a very good example of that. Of course, had been hunting and executing alleged witches, of course, for centuries. Between 1400 and 1800, it's estimated that 50,000 people all across Europe are executed for allegedly practicing witchcraft. And I keep saying allegedly because that's, of course, the whole problem is how do you prove you are not a witch if someone accuses you of being one? So this idea that witches are not only real, but that they are dangerous and they have to be hunted down and destroyed is actually very much a part of the belief systems that the English bring with them when they settle in the North American colonies, in this case in Puritan New England. And I think we can attribute a lot of this to the fact that in this time period, there isn't a lot of understanding about why things happen or how things happen. And so witches are a very, very, very convenient way of explaining, particularly explaining terrible things that happens. If a crop fails or if a child dies, blaming it on an accused witch, I think is a very convenient way to make the universe kind of make sense again. Now, even before Salem, there had been occasional episodes of witches being hanged in New England. It's worth noting that's one of the key differences between the execution of accused witches in Europe and in New England. In Europe, they're generally burned. In New England, they're generally hanged. There are no cases of witches being burned in New England, but an execution is an execution nonetheless. So it had happened occasionally before Salem, but it was fairly rare. So even in terms of hysteria about witches, what happens at Salem will be unique because of this involves so many people, so many accusations, and it basically takes over an entire community. Now, the community is Salem Village. There was Salem Village and there was Salem Town. Salem Town is modern-day Salem, Massachusetts. Salem Village is actually what's today Danvers, Massachusetts, but nonetheless, we can just call it the community of Salem Village in this time period. And the story, as I'm sure many of you remember, begins in spring 1692, and it begins in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, when a group of young girls begin to suffer from fits and nightmares. Allegedly, this started after they had been experimenting with fortune telling, but they begin to have nightmares and fits, and of course, the parents want to know what had happened, what was causing this, and so the girls immediately blame witches. And I think there's a good chance they did that so they themselves wouldn't get into trouble. Of course, we don't know for sure whether they believed it or not, but certainly their parents believe it when their daughters tell them that they are being tormented by witches, and that is what is causing their fits and their nightmares. Now, in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, there was a woman named Tituba. Tituba was an enslaved Indian from the Caribbean. She was working in the Parris household. She was, in fact, enslaved to the Parris family. And she becomes one of the first 3 women in the community who are accused of being witches. Very quickly, though, all across Salem Village, neighbors begin to turn on neighbors. Everybody begins to accuse people of being witches. Very quickly, accusations begin to fly all around the community. Starting with these young girls, but in fact very quickly spreading outside of the Parris household until it really sort of engulfed this whole community. So by the summer of 1692, 200 people had been accused of being witches. Keep in mind there's only a few hundred people who live in Salem Village to begin with. 3/4 of all the people who are accused will be women, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Now, when you're accused of being a witch, remember the problem here is how do you prove a negative? How do you prove that you aren't a witch? It's darn near impossible. So some of the accused do confess, and they confess simply to save their lives. If you confess to being a witch, you could be spared imprisonment and execution. But of course, a fair number of people refuse to confess. They insist that they were not witches, that they were not accused. Remember, to be a Puritan and be accused is a absolutely devastating thing. And so ultimately, 20 people are executed in 1692. Again, 3/4 of them are women. And another 5 people die in jail. People were held in jail for months at a time, often through horrible New England weather. Of course, they were in a stone jail, so they got sick and died. So ultimately, 25. As historians, and you are all now historians because you are taking this class, I think one of the intriguing things about Salem is trying to understand exactly what happened. How can this seemingly godly Puritan community have turned on its own in that way, to the point where ultimately it causes the death in that way, to the point where ultimately it causes the death of 25 people for witchcraft of all things? Now, there's still a lot of different theories about Salem. Odds are we will never know exactly for sure what triggered this. But depending on the book you read, depending on the historian you talk to, there are a couple of different theories about what happened at Salem that I think are worth exploring. The first is that this was some sort of mass religious induced hysteria. Remember that Puritans, as I said, were under a lot of stress. They were being now forced to tolerate the presence of other Protestant religions. To be a Puritan was already a very, very tough religious life. Remember, they believed that you were either saved or damned, and you would never know for sure which you were. And so some historians argue that it was sort of the Puritan religion itself that ultimately helped trigger the Salem witch trials, that sort of embedded in the Puritan belief system, this belief in punishment, this belief in potential damnation, this belief in sort of intolerance that may have actually turned into a form of hysteria and ultimately produced the tragedy of Salem. Another interesting theory that comes from the biological science side is the possibility of what's called ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on grain, and there are actually examples of ergot poisoning. If you Google it, there have been episodes in human history of ergot poisoning. And the reason ergot poisoning would be an interesting explanation for what happened at Salem is one of the symptoms of ergot poisoning is hallucinations. It's a bit like being on LSD. So people on ergot poisoning have convulsions and they hallucinate. And so perhaps there was something that had gone wrong with the grains, with the crops that were the main food source for the Puritans, and they had actually poisoned themselves with ergot, and that was why they were so convinced that they were seeing witches everywhere they looked. Again, no one's really been able to definitively prove that, but I do think it's an interesting theory. Sticking with the biological sciences, there's also a suggestion that there was an outbreak of encephalitis in the community. Encephalitis is an illness that causes swelling of the brain, and again, one of the symptoms of that is hallucination. Obviously, when you have swelling of the brain, all sorts of strange things start to happen. If there had been an outbreak of this illness, again, perhaps, maybe, that explains why people were so convinced they were seeing witches in their neighbors. Returning more to sort of the historical analysis side, another possible explanation is economic jealousy among neighbors. That in particular, that people resented each other, that this was a very small community and there were a lot of jealousies and resentments, particularly over money, and that they may have triggered this, that it may have been a way to get revenge against neighbors that were doing better than you and that you resented. And then sort of tying into the last point here is sort of this larger idea of social stress, right? The stress of the Indian Wars, the stress of the changes that England was forcing on them, the stress of the Puritans no longer being in total control of their community, the stress of social change, that in essence what we might have here is a community that just sort of collectively snapped, if you will. So again, are any of these correct? Are all of them correct? Are some of them correct? We don't know. And again, it's going to depend entirely on which historian you read as to which of these theories they argue for. But I do think it's worth sort of pointing out that these are some of the possible explanations. I'll just mention very quickly here that this is actually one of the accounts, one of the very first accounts of the Salem witch trials, written by Cotton Mather in 1693. Cotton Mather was actually involved in the prosecution of quite a few of those witches. So even from the minute this episode ended, it was already becoming famous. There were already books being written about what had happened, only in this case, of course, Cotton Mather argues that there were, in fact, real witches. He would maintain that actually for many, many years, that what he had done was the right thing to do. Of course, today, people who write about the Salem witch trials are much more interested in, if we assume that witches are not real, then what other possible explanations are there? And on this slide, I just thought I'd show you some photos that I took the last time that I was in Salem. Modern day Salem, Massachusetts does in fact have sort of a whole tourist industry around the Salem witch trials, which to be honest is not entirely, a lot of it's not historically accurate. But this is actually a monument that they do have in Salem to those men and women who were killed in the Salem witch trials. Basically, these are stone seats that are built into like a little gathering area, and you can sort of walk around and read everyone's names. And then embedded in the floor, you actually have quotes from some of the trial transcripts. So here, for example, we see the memorials for Giles Corey and Susanna Martin. You'll notice it has how they died, as well as the date on which they died. And then on the bottom, as I said, as part of the walkway, these are just random quotes taken from the trial transcripts. And it's in fact very moving. In most cases, we don't know where ultimately the remains of the victims were buried. They were not buried in the surviving cemetery. So this is sort of the only memorial we have left to recognize the deaths of these 25 men and women in this moment of mass hysteria. Now, for me, as a historian, one of the things I find most intriguing about the Salem witch trials is trying to explain that statistic I showed you, where 3/4 of the people accused and 3/4 of the people executed are women. So, how might we account for that specifically? Well, there are historians who have done an analysis of the victims of the Salem witch trial, and they find that in addition to being mostly women, they also have a couple of other variables in common. So, for example, most of them tended to be women beyond childbearing age, so women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. They also tended to be women who were known in the community as being outspoken or difficult. So they were people who were perhaps already known for not being the easiest people to get along with in the community. Several of them were dependent women, which meant that they weren't really answerable to anyone in the community. They had money to live on. And again, we talked about jealousy being a possible factor in who got accused. Also, a lot of the women were either widows or otherwise estranged from their husbands, or in some other way violated the gender norms of the day. So I think one thing that analysis can tell us is that in addition to being mostly female, these were also women who, for whatever reason, didn't really fit in, or at least were perceived to be people who didn't fit in to the Puritan community in Salem. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence that the people who get victimized tend to be the people who are already in some way, shape, or form sticking out. And particularly the issue of money and the possible way that money fits into this. We talked a little bit about sort of the ways in which jealousy and may have fueled this. And that could have been particularly true in families due to the ways in which inheritance laws worked in British North America. So when a woman lost her husband, the inheritance didn't go to her. It always went to his eldest son. However, under British law, a widow was entitled to what were called dower rights. And a dower was a portion of the estate that went to a widow to give her something to live on in her old age. Now, it could very well be that one of the resentments in a lot of these families was that dower right, particularly if perhaps the woman wasn't your mother, but was perhaps your stepmother, which was very common in colonial New England. So it could be perhaps that Some women were accused maybe as a way of family members to get them out of their way so that they could have access to whatever financial resource women had. Again, I think it's just a possibility, but at least the data that has been produced so far is very suggestive in terms of these generally being women who had some property that someone might want to get their hands on. And again, the fact that so many of these women were either widowed or estranged from their husband, I think becomes doubly important when you look at the statistic that 89% of the women who ultimately got executed in the Salem witch trials also had no brother or son. So these were not just women who kind of stuck out in their communities, but they were also women who didn't have men to intervene, didn't have men to perhaps speak on their behalf or plead for mercy on their behalf. And again, keep in mind that in a community like Salem, that's Puritan, that is very hierarchical, where men are supposed to be in charge, the fact that a lot of the women who ultimately got executed specifically were women who didn't have a man to sort of speak for them the way Puritans expected does suggest that there was definitely a gender dynamic at work here. So again, we'll never know for sure exactly what happened in Salem. But again, I encourage you to think about this in terms of being another illustration of some of the tremendous stresses and strains that we can see at the British North American colonies. Now, there's a couple of other changes that I think we have to account for as we begin to transition from the 1600s into the 1700s. And one of them is, again, this idea that in spite of all of this conflict and turmoil, this is a period of growth for all of the colonies, both in terms of growth for all of the colonies, both in terms of population and in terms of economic power. Now, up until this point, as we've talked about, in many of the colonies, there's basically two groups of people. There's wealthy landowners and there's indentured servants or slaves. That's particularly true in the southern colonies, but even in the New England colonies, slavery is perfectly legal, and so you see that as well. What begins to change in this late 1600s, early 1700s, is that for the first time you begin to get a growing population of people who are in between. These are sort of craftsmen and what today we might call professionals. So carpenters and teachers and ministers and weavers and candle makers. Today, these are folks that we might call middle class. That's, of course, a concept that doesn't exist in this time period. But again, think of these as being, not the elites, but not sort of servants or slaves either. So we're beginning to see the growth of sort of a middling population in most of the colonies, which again is going to be good in terms of diversifying the economy. The other thing we're beginning to see is some ethnic diversity as well. And we see this most notably in Pennsylvania and New York, which becomes home to large numbers of German immigrants in the late 1600s and early 1700s. In fact, approximately 85,000 of them. And these were mainly Protestant Germans who were fleeing religious persecution in whatever state in Germany they came from, or Catholic Germans who were living in a Protestant German state and likewise were being persecuted. So for Germans in general, regardless of religion, it was, again, this idea that they could practice more freely in the British North American colonies. So about 85,000 of them come to the British North American colonies, again, settling mainly in Pennsylvania and New York. And what's interesting about the Germans is that their presence And the fact that they came from someplace other than England, which up until this point everyone had come from England, and also that, of course, they spoke a first language other than English, they were obviously all native German speakers, actually sparks the first real immigration debate that the colonies will have. Immigration isn't, of course, the term they use. They don't really talk about it in terms of immigration, but it's actually one of the readings you have for this week. And I think it's really interesting to look at some of the debate that the presence of these Germans triggers in the British colonies, and the ways in which, in some ways, it's not that different from some of the conversations we continue to have about immigration all the way through the present day. Now, the other important thing about this continued growth in the colonies is that there is this still never-ending hunger for land. In spite of this growing class of sort of craftsmen and professionals, most people are going to make their living in some kind of agriculture. So we continue to see more and more people pushing into land that belongs to the surviving indigenous groups in the area, using force to eject Indians from their land, or tricking them out of their land in suspicious land deals, even in places like Pennsylvania that had historically had I wouldn't really call it a positive, but at least a less bad relationship with the indigenous peoples. By the time you get to the early 1700s, even in Pennsylvania, increasingly the surviving indigenous groups are either being just pushed out of the way or tricked out of their land so that settlers could take it. Now, the other thing that this demand for land does is it opens up new areas of settlement, and we refer to these areas collectively as the backcountry. And basically, it was this new area of colonial settlement, and you see it on the map on the right, that stretches from what's today sort of central Pennsylvania through the Valley and into western North and South Carolina. Okay, and you can see that here. So again, people are pushing further and further west in pursuit of land, and they're opening up new areas to settlement where there hadn't been Europeans before. And of course, this leads to growing conflict with native peoples, which we'll be talking a lot in the next couple of lectures. Now, most of the people in the backcountry, again, are farmers. Most of them raise grain and livestock. These are not going to be great plantations, even in the South. They're mostly small farms. But nonetheless, we still have an overwhelmingly Now, in addition to the growth of agricultural settlement, it's also worth noting that it is in this time period, the early 1700s, that colonial towns like Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Charleston, South Carolina, all start to grow into large cities. And what's making them into large cities is that most of these are port towns, and of course, they're made wealthy through trade and through their close relationship with England. So we do begin to see the emergence of really the first cities in the British North American colonies in this era as well. And for the elites, for the wealthy, this was a time where the standard of living was rising quite rapidly with these close trade relationships with England. If you had the money, you could get, nice fabrics and porcelain and tea and all of sort of the luxuries of life imported to you. So if you were a relatively wealthy person in one of these colonial towns, you increasingly were actually living in many ways the way you might have lived at home in England. So your standing of living was quite a bit higher. However, at the same time, there was also a growing population of people dependent on wage earners, people who had to work for other people in the colonies, and also a growing population of simply poor people in the colonies. So what today we would call income inequality is starting to kick in, where you have the elites, you have people in the middle, you have people who sort of have to work for a living, and then you have the very poor. And we know this because it's also in this time period that you see the creation of the first workhouses in colonial North America. And if you've ever read a Charles Dickens novel, you're probably familiar with the concept of a workhouse. It was the way that poverty was dealt with in European societies in the 1600s and 1700s, basically institutionalized people in a workhouse where they had to work to pay off their debt before they could get free. It's really quite a brutal way of treating the poor. But I think the fact that you're seeing the creation of workhouses tells you about the ways in which American colonial society is getting ever more stratified, ever more divided up between the wealthy, the middle, and the very bottom. And in fact, it's true if we look at the way simply wealth is distributed. So by 1750, half of all the wealth of British North American colonies is concentrated in the hands of the richest 10% of the population. So the richest 10% own half the wealth. So it is a tremendous and an ever-growing income inequality, as we would say today, in the colonies. Now, keep in mind, too, that at this point, the American colonies, the British North American colonies, are really just one part in a much, much larger British colonial world. Keep in mind, it's not just England and the American colonies. It's, of course, also Canada. It's the British possessions in the Caribbean. It's India, which they will soon take control over as well. So this is a growing and expanding British colonial world that's really sort of all tied together by the economic and the military power of Britain. So, for example, Britain very tightly regulates colonial trade. So if you had been one of those wealthy merchants in Boston or Charleston, you weren't free to do business with whoever you wanted. It was expected you had to do business with England. We talked in a previous lecture about an axe, for example, that goods had to be shipped on British ships. So it wasn't as if you had sort of freedom of trade. You were still very much understood to be expected to do business with England. However, the flip side of this were some advantages. You were recognized as a British citizen, at least if you were white. And also, for example, to protect that trade, you had the power of the British Royal Navy, which was the most powerful naval force on Earth in the 1700s. So there were definitely some downsides to being part of this empire, but there were also some upsides as well, in terms of getting the prestige and the protection of being part. Okay, so before we move on to the next couple of lectures, I just want us to pause here and take a minute and sort of remind ourselves about where we are in the history of colonial North America at this time period. So, just as a refresher to what we've talked about, by the early 1700s, you have the southern colonies. These are colonies like Carolina and Virginia and Maryland. And these colonies are focused on what we call staple crop agriculture, meaning they grow one thing and it's something that's usually for export. It's sold. These are crops like tobacco and sugar and rice and indigo. And what's notable about that is that staple crop agriculture requires a lot of land and a lot of labor. So increasingly, the key feature of the southern colonies will be plantation agriculture and, of course, the use of slave labor. So we're seeing that's sort of the direction that the southern colonies are increasingly moving in. That's not to say everybody in the southern colonies is engaged in staple agriculture, but most of the wealthiest people are. And so, in turn, you have the emergence of a wealthy class, sort of a gentry class, the elite in the southern colonies. And these are primarily planters, right? People who are part of this plantation agriculture system, or at least come from families that are. And this will be important as we move through the 1700s, because of course it's that southern gentry class that's going to produce people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Now, in the northern colonies like New York, the New England colonies, Pennsylvania, here increasingly it's focused on family farms. So you don't see staple agriculture, you see family farms growing, fruits and vegetables and cows and chickens and that kind of thing. Or they're involved in some kind of trade in the port cities. So Boston is a huge port city, Philadelphia is a port city, Newport, Rhode Island, you name it. So increasingly, we're getting a fair amount of economic difference between the northern colonies and the southern colonies. And of course, what both have in common, though, is this never-ending appetite for land. So both those Southerners practicing plantation agriculture and those in the north practicing family farms, there's still always going to be this constant demand for land. And at the heart, really, of the 1700s, as we head towards the American Revolution, in part, a big part of the debate will be the where and how and why freedom fits to all of this, and specifically who ultimately gets to be free. Right? We saw that debate beginning to change at the start of today's lecture with the Glorious Revolution in England, and we're continuing to see that play out as we move through the 1700s. So this question about freedom, and specifically who gets to be free in colonial North America, are going to be key issues in the next set of lectures, as we look first at politics and the 7 Years' War, the fallout from the 7 Years' War, and then, of course, ultimately, the